At 6:47 p.m. on October 14, 1943, Colonel Cass Sheffield Huff stood on the flight line of an 8th Air Force base in England, counting the empty spaces in the sky where bombers should have been returning from Schweinfurt. 60B, 17 flying fortresses were missing. Huff was 39 years old, commander of the Air Technical Section, and he had spent the last 2 years watching his solution space collapse while his bombers were destroyed in the air. That day alone, more than 600 American airmen were dead over Germany. The loss rate had reached 20%, twice what planners considered survivable. At that rate, the 8th Air Force would bleed itself out in months. The pattern was merciless and predictable. American bombers flew deep into the Reich. Their P-47 Thunderbolt escorts ran out of fuel and turned back at the German border. Luftwaffe fighters waited. Once the escorts disappeared, German interceptors swarmed the unprotected formations. In just 3 hours, 60 flying fortresses were shot down. 17 more limped home, so damaged they would never fly again. Another 121 aircraft returned riddled with holes, crews alive by chance alone. The math didn't lie. This wasn't a setback. It was extinction by arithmetic. Huff had watched this slaughter repeat itself for 9 straight months. His engineers tested modifications, evaluated tactics, pushed every available fighter to its limits. Nothing worked. The P-47 lacked range. The P-38 Lightning had the range on paper, but not in the field. Drop tanks were scarce. The new P-51 Mustang showed real promise, but without external fuel, it still couldn't reach Berlin. And there was a deeper problem no flight manual could fix. The United States had run out of aluminum. Every usable pound was already committed to bombers, fighters, ships, tanks. There simply wasn't enough metal left to manufacture drop tanks at the scale required. No tanks meant no escort. No escort meant dead bomber crews. Huff understood this problem differently than most officers. He hadn't come up through West Point. He had been commissioned directly from civilian life in 1938 after serving as vice president of Daisy Manufacturing Company, the BB gun firm. He understood mass production, material shortages, and how to build something cheaply, repeatedly, and fast. And he knew something others dismissed. The British had experimented with something the Americans had laughed off as absurd: paper fuel tanks. The Royal Air Force had tested craft paper tanks impregnated with waterproof resin on Spitfires. The results had been mixed. Tanks leaked. Some failed at altitude. Others burst when jettisoned. General Ira Eaker had briefly tested them on P-47s and declared them unworkable. But Huff saw the flaw in the conclusion. The idea hadn't failed. The manufacturing had. The British tests suffered from poor quality control, bad lamination, weak bonding, inconsistent resin curing. But the underlying concept, the physics, was sound. Paper was cheap. Paper was abundant. Paper required zero aluminum. And if the technical problems could be solved, paper could do something metal no longer could: save bomber crews by the thousands. Huff started work in late October 1943. His requirements were uncompromising. The tank had to hold 110 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel. It had to survive 30,000 feet of altitude. It had to endure temperatures from -40 degrees Fahrenheit to +100 degrees Fahrenheit. It could not leak. It could not rupture. And it had to weigh less and cost a fraction of a metal tank. He partnered with Bowater Lloyd's, a British paper mill outside London. Together, they laminated layers of heavy craft paper using resorcinol glue, forming a shell just 1/8 of an inch thick. It looked fragile. It wasn't. The finished tank was waterproof, flexible under stress, and strong enough to hold fuel without deformation. The first test units went to P-47 squadrons in December 1943. Pilots were openly skeptical. Flying into combat with paper tanks strapped under your wings felt like suicide. But the tanks didn't leak. They didn't rupture. When jettisoned, they fell away cleanly instead of tumbling into aircraft. By January 1944, Bowater Lloyd's was producing tanks at scale, 15 per day, then 30, then 60. Huff sent samples to Wright Field, Ohio, for official evaluation. 2 weeks later, the report came back. The tanks were declared absolutely unfeasible. The program was recommended for immediate cancellation. By the time that memo landed on Huff's desk, 8th Air Force fighters had already flown over 15,000 combat sorties using paper tanks, without a single failure. Huff ignored right field. Instead, he went directly to Major General James Jimmy Doolittle, who had taken command of the 8th Air Force in January 1944. Doolittle understood the math immediately. Every paper tank meant one more P-51 Mustang could fly 400 miles deeper into Germany. Every Mustang that reached Berlin meant fewer German fighters attacking bombers. Fewer fighters meant fewer losses. Fewer losses meant the bombing campaign could survive. Doolittle authorized mass production. The numbers were staggering. A paper tank weighed 11 pounds empty. A metal tank of the same size weighed 42 pounds. Paper cost $8 per tank. Metal cost $63. For the weight and price of one metal tank, Huff could produce 6 paper tanks, with no aluminum required. By February 1944, WWII was producing 200 paper tanks per day. They began appearing under the wings of P-51 Mustangs across England. Each added 110 gallons of fuel. Combined with internal tanks, a Mustang could now carry 420 gallons total, enough for a 750-mile combat radius. London to Berlin and back. On March 4, 1944, the first escort mission to Berlin launched. Colonel Donald Blakesley led 68 Mustangs of the 4th Fighter Group. Every aircraft carried 2 paper tanks. The fighters climbed to 25,000 feet, crossed the Channel, rendezvoused with the bomber stream, and did not turn back. German pilots were stunned. Single-engine American fighters over Berlin were supposed to be impossible. That day, the Mustangs fought Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs over the capital, shot down 17 German aircraft, and escorted the bombers all the way home. Bomber losses dropped to 2%. 9 aircraft lost, compared to 60 at Schweinfurt. The paper tanks had changed the war, and they were just getting started. By the spring of 1944, the scale of the problem became unmistakable. Each fighter group operated 72 aircraft. Each aircraft required 2 external tanks per mission. That meant 144 tanks per group, per sortie. With 16 fighter groups assigned to the 8th Air Force, a single large bombing mission required 2,304 drop tanks. If the 8th flew 6 days a week, the demand reached nearly 14,000 tanks every week, more than 60,000 tanks per month. WWII alone could not meet that demand. Huff moved the problem the way a factory executive would, not a staff officer. He distributed standardized blueprints and material specifications to paper mills across Britain, Scotland, Wales, the Midlands. Any plant capable of laminating heavy craft paper could be converted to production. By April 1944, 7 mills were manufacturing his design. Output climbed rapidly. 400 tanks per day, then 600. By May, British factories were delivering 800 paper drop tanks every single day. For the first time, fuel supply was no longer the limiting factor in fighter escort planning. The tactical consequences were immediate and profound. Before Huff's innovation, escort planning resembled a relay race. Spitfires covered the bombers over the Channel. P-47 Thunderbolts took over across France. P-38 Lightnings escorted as far as Western Germany. Then the bombers flew alone for the final 200 miles, exactly where German defenses were strongest. Those handoff points created gaps. The Luftwaffe exploited them mercilessly. Paper tanks erased the handoffs. With extended range, P-51 Mustangs could escort bombers from takeoff to target and all the way home. One fighter type, one continuous umbrella of protection. No gaps, no fuel-based tinbacks. Mustangs launched from England, rendezvoused with the bomber stream over the North Sea, stayed with it over Germany's industrial heartland, fought enemy interceptors over the target, and escorted the bombers back across the Channel. 8 hours, 1,100 miles. Continuous cover. The Luftwaffe had trained for a war where escorts always left. That assumption was now obsolete. Mustangs with paper tanks appeared everywhere: Berlin, Munich, Stuttgart, Vienna, Nuremberg. German pilots could no longer wait for vulnerability. Every interception meant fighting American escorts that were faster, higher climbing, and tactically coordinated. Losses mounted fast. In April 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 472 fighter pilots. In May, another 391. Experienced squadron leaders disappeared. Formation discipline collapsed. Fighters began attacking alone or in pairs. Easy prey for coordinated Mustang formations flying in groups of 16. Bomber crews noticed immediately. Missions that had been near suicidal 6 months earlier became survivable. Flak remained deadly. Weather still scattered formations. Mechanical failures still forced aborts. But the massive fighter swarms that had shattered bomber streams in 1943 were gone. By late spring, the skies over Germany belonged to the Americans. The cost-benefit numbers were staggering. Through May 1944, Huff's paper tank program cost less than $120,000, including research, tooling, and production of 47,000 tanks. Based on the reduction in bomber loss rates, analysts estimated the tanks saved approximately 800 B-17s. Each flying fortress carried 10 men. That meant 8,000 lives. Financially, the calculation was just as stark. 800 bombers at $200,000 each represented $160 million, not counting the training cost of the crews. A 6-figure investment had prevented 9-figure losses. But the real impact went far beyond economics. By October 1943, daylight strategic bombing had been close to collapse. Senior commanders debated abandoning it entirely, switching to night operations, or restricting bombing to tactical targets. Huff's tanks saved the strategy itself. They gave General Henry Hap Arnold the proof he needed that long-range escort was not only possible, but sustainable. With that assurance, the 8th Air Force resumed daylight bombing at full scale. In February 1944, the campaign relaunched with Big Week, 5 days of maximum effort strikes against German aircraft factories. More than 3,000 bomber sorties flew with loss rates averaging 4%. Acceptable. Sustainable. German production briefly surged. Fighter output peaked in September 1944, but the Luftwaffe could not replace trained pilots fast enough. New aircraft rolled off assembly lines. Inexperienced pilots died on their first missions. The planes existed. The men did not. The consequences were unmistakable on June 6, 1944. On D-Day, Allied aircraft flew 14,000 sorties over Normandy. The Luftwaffe managed 319. German fighters attempting to reach the beaches ran into walls of Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Spitfires. Most turned back. Those that pressed in were destroyed. Allied pilots claimed 36 German aircraft that day. The Luftwaffe achieved nothing. Paper-drop tanks had made that dominance possible. Without long-range fuel capacity, American fighters could not have maintained continuous coverage over the Channel and the beachhead. Huff himself flew combat missions to validate his design. In March 1944, he took AP-47 Thunderbolt on a fighter sweep over France, 2 paper tanks under the wings. The mission lasted 4 hours. The tanks fed fuel smoothly. When he thought he spotted enemy fighters, he jettisoned them. They fell away cleanly. False alarm, but the test confirmed the system worked. In April, he flew AP-51 Mustang on an escort mission to Brunswick, 6 hours gate to gate. High altitude. Extreme cold. The tanks showed no leaks, no distortion, no structural weakness. When he landed, the attachment points were bone dry. Quality control became Huff's obsession. He inspected factories weekly. Random tanks were pulled from production and tested to destruction. Every 1,000th tank was filled with water and pressurized until failure. Average burst pressure, 80 psi, 3 times operational requirements. Meanwhile, German intelligence took notice. Captured Luftwaffe documents from June 1944 ordered pilots to target external fuel tanks specifically. The logic was simple. Ignite the tanks, force Mustangs to jettison early, shorten escort range. In practice, the tactic failed. Paper tanks were surprisingly fire-resistant. The craft paper did not ignite easily. Tracer and incendiary rounds often punched clean holes straight through without combustion. Fuel-soaked paper sealed around bullet holes through capillary action. Pilots reported landing with 5 or 6 hits and minimal fuel loss. When a tank did ignite, it was jettisoned instantly, gone in under 2 seconds, burning thousands of feet below the aircraft. In the first 6 months of paper tank operations, no P-51 was lost to external fuel tank fire. Metal tanks were not so forgiving. Damaged metal tanks sometimes jammed on release. Several P-47s crashed attempting emergency landings with partially attached tanks that destabilized the aircraft. Paper tanks, by contrast, were expendable by design. Cheap, light, disposable. And by the summer of 1944, they had quietly become one of the most decisive innovations of the air war over Europe. Paper tanks solved the problem completely. They always released. They always fell clean. By July 1944, the 8th Air Force had used 93,000 paper drop tanks in combat operations. Total recorded failures, 17. That represented a failure rate of 0.018%. Every failure traced back to one production batch from a single factory. Huff shut the line down immediately. Every tank from that facility was inspected and rejected. The mill corrected its quality control process within a week. No further failures were ever recorded from that source. The numbers spoke for themselves. The program expanded beyond fighters. B-24 Liberators began carrying paper ferry tanks for long-distance repositioning flights. Transport aircraft used them to extend supply missions. Even B-17s experimented with paper tanks for extreme-range strikes into Poland and Czechoslovakia. The design proved adaptable across airframes and climates. German engineers got their first close look in June 1944, when a P-51 jettisoned its tanks over France and one landed intact in a farmer's field. Wehrmacht Technical Intelligence examined it in disbelief. Their report concluded that American industry must be so short of metal it had resorted to desperation. They missed the point entirely. Huff hadn't built paper tanks because metal was scarce. He built them because paper was better. By August 1944, British factories had produced 147,000 paper tanks at a total cost of $176 million. The same number of metal tanks would have cost $261 million. The savings exceeded $8 million, while performance surpassed metal tanks in every category except reusability, which didn't matter. These tanks were meant to be dropped. Huff was recommended for promotion 3 times in 1944. He refused all of them. Already a full colonel, he had no interest in staff billets or headquarters politics. He wanted to stay with his technical section, testing equipment, solving problems, keeping pilots alive. His commanders respected that and gave him unusual autonomy. His next project focused on gun sights. American pilots were missing too many deflection shots. German fighters were slipping through formations at high speed. But Huff kept the drop tank program as his priority. Fuel remained the decisive variable. Even after the Normandy breakout, the 8th Air Force still needed maximum range. Targets deep inside Germany, synthetic oil refineries, ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, required missions lasting 6 to 8 hours. Without paper tanks, those strikes would have stopped at the frontier. Statistics from August 1944 made the impact unmistakable. That month, the 8th Air Force flew 7,200 bomber sorties. Loss rate, 1%. In October 1943, the loss rate had been 1%. The difference was fighter escort. The escort existed because of range. The range came from paper tanks. Bomber crews felt it immediately. They watched Mustangs rendezvous over the North Sea and stay. They saw escorts circle overhead during bomb runs. They saw damaged stragglers protected on the way home. Crews who once expected death now expected survival. The psychological shift was enormous. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt. They massed fighters, 100 aircraft at a time, accepting losses in exchange for brief breakthroughs. Occasionally, it worked. On September 11th, German fighters broke through near Stuttgart, destroying 12 B-17s in 4 minutes. But those attacks grew rarer. The Mustangs learned faster. And the Mustangs had fuel. With paper tanks, pilots could chase German fighters for 50 miles, destroy them, and still return to formation. Without that fuel margin, every engagement shortened the trip home. Before paper tanks, pilots had to disengage early. Now they could finish the fight. By September 1944, factories had delivered 200,000 paper tanks. Every American fighter group in England, Italy, and the Pacific used them. Across all theaters, the failure rate stood at 0.02%, 40 tanks out of 200,000. The Pacific embraced them immediately. Mustangs escorting B-29 superfortresses from Iwo Jima faced 1,500-mile round trips. impossible without external fuel. Metal tanks were even scarcer there. Paper tanks were lighter, cheaper, and flawless in tropical conditions. Huff visited Saipan in October 1944 expecting heat and humidity to degrade the tanks. He found none. Weeks of outdoor storage had no effect. The tanks flew missions to Truk and Formosa without issue. By late 1944, the European war was entering its final phase. Airfields moved closer to the front. Some missions no longer required external tanks, but the deepest strikes still did. Berlin, Dresden, Czechoslovakia. Paper tanks remained essential. The final numbers revealed the true scale. From January to December 1944, Allied fighters destroyed approximately 5,000 Luftwaffe aircraft in air-to-air combat over Europe. The majority fell to P-51 Mustangs flying long-range escort missions. 90% of those missions used paper tanks. The chain was direct and unbroken. Paper tanks gave Mustangs range. Range gave them time over target. Time over target destroyed the Luftwaffe. Huff never claimed credit. He built fuel tanks. Pilots flew the missions. Pilots pulled the triggers. But without those paper shells, the fighters would have turned back at the border, and those victories would never have happened. By May 8, 1945, Allied factories had produced 412,000 paper drop tanks. Total program cost, $3. $296 million. Equivalent metal tanks, $25. $956 million. Savings, $22. $66 million. Strategic materials used, 0. More importantly, paper tanks enabled 19,000 long-range escort missions. Analysts estimated those missions prevented the loss of 2,000 heavy bombers, 20,000 aircrew lives. The mathematics were merciless. The result was unmistakable. A war that had nearly broken the 8th Air Force in 1943 was won in the skies of 1944 because someone realized that paper, properly engineered, could carry fuel farther than metal ever had. $3 million invested in paper and glue saved $22 million in manufacturing costs and prevented more than $400 million in bomber losses. A 130-to-1 return on investment. No other single modification program in the entire war produced results even remotely comparable at such a low cost. Colonel Cass Sheffield Huff rotated back to the United States in October 1945. The war in Europe was over. The war in the Pacific had ended 2 months earlier. His air technical section disbanded. Test pilots, engineers, and mechanics scattered to new assignments or returned to civilian life. Huff had spent 3 years and 4 months on active duty in England. He had flown P-38s, P-47s, and P-51s. He had evaluated hundreds of aircraft modifications. He had tested dozens of ideas that never worked. But the paper drop tank remained his defining contribution. Wright Field never apologized for declaring the tanks unfeasible. The engineers who wrote the report simply stopped referencing it. By late 1944, even Wright Field was quietly ordering paper tanks for test programs of its own. The official Air Force history of World War II equipment development mentioned Huff's paper tanks in 3 paragraphs. It acknowledged the cost savings. It noted their reliability. Then it moved on. No drama. No mention of how close the program came to being canceled. No recognition that theory had almost overruled reality. Huff did not care. He returned to Daisy Manufacturing Company in Michigan, resumed his position as vice president, later became president, and ran the company for 28 years. He built BB guns. He managed factories. He never spoke publicly about his war work. His employees knew he had served. Few knew what he had done. The Distinguished Flying Cross he received for a 43,000-foot dive in a P-38 Lightning. Testing the aircraft beyond all known limits, sat in a drawer at home. The citation spoke of deliberately entering unknown regions of flight. It said nothing about paper tanks. After the war, the paper drop tanks vanished. Surplus stocks were burned or buried. No one wanted to store obsolete fuel tanks made of craft paper. The factories that produced them converted back to cardboard boxes and shipping containers. Bowater Lloyd returned to ordinary paper production. The specialized gluing equipment was scrapped. Within 2 years, not a single paper drop tank remained in military inventory. But the idea did not disappear. Post-war aircraft designers recognized the principle Huff had proven under combat conditions. Expendable components do not need durability, only reliability. They must work once, flawlessly, at minimum cost. That philosophy shaped everything from rocket stages to missile fairings to modern external fuel tanks. Deliberate disposability in aerospace engineering traced directly back to paper tanks hanging under Mustang wings over Germany. The pilots never forgot them. Veterans of the 8th Air Force wrote about the paper tanks with disbelief and gratitude. How could paper carry fuel at 40,000 feet? How could glue survive combat damage? How could something so cheap work so perfectly? The answer was never the material. It was the engineering. Simple materials, intelligent design, relentless testing, mass production with strict quality control. Colonel Cass Sheffield Huff died on September 17, 1990. He was 85 years old. His obituaries mentioned his World War II service, his distinguished flying cross, his long career at Daisy Manufacturing. None mentioned paper drop tanks. None connected his name to the 5,000 German aircraft destroyed by fighters his tanks had enabled. But the mathematics remain. 412,000 paper tanks produced, $3 million invested, $22 million saved in manufacturing, $400 million saved in prevented bomber losses, 20,000 aircrew lives preserved. One man saw a problem everyone else considered unsolvable. He found a solution everyone else dismissed as impossible. And he proved them wrong with craft paper and glue. Wright Field said paper tanks were unfeasible. They were correct, in theory. Paper should not hold fuel. Paper should not survive altitude. Paper should not withstand combat damage. Huff never asked whether paper should work. He asked whether paper could work. Then he built it, tested it, deployed it. 15,000 tanks were already in combat service before Wright Field finished its evaluation. That single fact summarized his approach. The bureaucrats wanted studies. Huff gave them data. They wanted predictions. He gave them results. They said impossible. He showed them 412,000 tanks that worked. And the war was won with them hanging under wings, made of paper, doing exactly what theory said they never could.